Imagine the most perfect world you could ever dream of. Picture cities made of pure crystal floating gracefully above planets, where every single day felt like paradise. Gardens stretched as far as you could see, with flowers that changed colors based on your mood. The air itself seemed to sparkle with some kind of natural magic that made everything feel peaceful and calm. This was life for the Zilani Confederation, and they'd been living this way for over 3,000 years. Not 300, not 30, 3,000 years of absolute peace. These people had evolved so far beyond conflict that they literally didn't understand what the word war meant anymore. Their children grew up never knowing fear, never seeing violence, never even raising their voices in anger. When Zilani diplomats met other species, they'd solve problems by talking. Just talking. They'd sit down, share some of their incredible fruit that tasted like liquid sunshine, and work everything out through discussion. Their technology was built around harmony. Energy shields that gently pushed things away rather than destroying them. Transportation that moved smoothly through space without disturbing anything. Communication systems designed to find common ground between different species. Their entire society was built on the idea that intelligence naturally led to peace. They believed that any species smart enough to reach the stars would automatically leave behind primitive things like fighting and aggression. In their minds, evolution meant moving toward perfect cooperation and understanding. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. The Ravagers came from somewhere beyond the mapped galaxy, from the dark spaces between star systems where nothing was supposed to live. Nobody detected them approaching, because nobody was scanning for that kind of threat. Why would they? The galaxy had been peaceful for millennia. The first sign something was wrong came from the outer colony worlds. Communication simply stopped. Not gradually, not with distress signals or call for help, just complete, sudden silence. One day the daily reports were coming in normally, talking about harvest festivals and art exhibitions. The next day, nothing. When the Zilani finally sent investigation ships to check on these quiet worlds, what they found broke their understanding of what was possible. The planets were still there, still spinning in their orbits, but they were empty, not destroyed, drained. Every trace of life, every building, every piece of technology had been systematically consumed and absorbed. The investigative crews barely had time to send back their horrified reports before the Ravagers found them too. These weren't just aliens. They were something that challenged the very concept of natural life. Imagine if someone took the worst parts of every nightmare creature you could think of, then covered them in advanced technology, and gave them the intelligence to use it. Each Ravager was the size of a small city, with mechanical parts fused directly into organic tissue. They moved through space like a plague of metal insects, each one capable of stripping an entire world down to bare rock. But the truly terrifying part wasn't their size or their technology. It was how they operated. The Ravagers didn't conquer worlds. They absorbed them. Every living thing, every piece of useful material, every scrap of knowledge got broken down and added to their collective mass. They were like a cosmic virus that grew stronger with everything they consumed. The Zilani tried everything their peaceful civilization could think of. They attempted diplomatic contact, broadcasting messages of greeting and offers of cooperation. The Ravagers responded by consuming the communication satellites. They tried their defensive shields, elegant energy barriers that had protected them for centuries. The Ravagers adapted to the shield frequencies in minutes and simply walked through them. World after world went silent. 17 entire planets, each one home to billions of Zilani, just stopped existing as living worlds. The refugees who escaped painted pictures of mechanical swarms blotting out the sun, of cities being dissolved like sugar and acid, of families disappearing into collective mass of the invaders. The surviving Zilani leadership did something their species had never done in 3,000 years. They panicked. In their desperation, they sent out emergency broadcasts across every frequency they could access, reaching out to every corner of the galaxy. They offered their most precious treasures, their accumulated scientific knowledge, their most advanced technology. Anything for someone, anyone, who still remembered how to fight. Most civilized species responded with sympathy, but little else. After all, they'd also evolved past warfare. Violence was considered a primitive phase that intelligent species naturally grew out of. The idea of actually fighting these ravagers seemed impossible. But far out in the dangerous rim territories, where only the desperate or crazy dared to venture, something picked up their signal. Something that had never forgotten how to fight, because on their world, everything had always been trying to kill them. And these creatures were about to remind the galaxy why some species never gave up their weapons. When the human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of Zilani territory, the first thing anyone noticed was how wrong they looked. These weren't the sleek, graceful vessels that civilized species built. These ships looked like they'd been designed by someone who expected to get shot at regularly and wanted to make sure they could keep fighting even after taking a beating. Every hull was a patchwork of different metals, welded repairs visible from kilometers away. Some ships had entire sections that were clearly salvaged from other vessels, bolted on wherever they'd fit. The armor plating was thick, ugly, and practical. The kind of protection you'd use if prettiness was less important than not dying. Weapon systems sprouted from every available surface like mechanical thorns, and not the elegant energy weapons most species preferred, but crude projectile systems that looked like they could punch holes through asteroids. But the really unsettling part was how these ships moved. They didn't glide smoothly through space like proper vessels should. They moved like predators, constantly adjusting position, scanning for threats, ready to fight at a moment's notice. Their formation wasn't the orderly parade formation peaceful species used. It was a combat spread designed to provide mutual support if someone started shooting. The Zilani space traffic controllers didn't know what to make of them. These ships registered as belonging to a species called humans from something called Earth, but their databases had almost no information about either. What little they could find suggested these humans came from somewhere in the outer rim territories, the dangerous edges of known space where most civilized species didn't bother going. When Captain David Morrison's shuttle docked with the main Zilani command station, the cultural shock hit both sides like a physical blow. The Zilani had prepared their most beautiful reception hall, with crystal walls that sang soft harmonies and flowers that released calming scents. Everything was designed to promote peace and understanding. Morrison stepped out of his shuttle, looking like he'd walked straight out of their darkest legends. His left arm had been replaced with mechanical parts that moved with precision no organic limb could match. Scars crossed his face like a roadmap of violence, and his eyes held the kind of wariness that came from expecting trouble everywhere. He wore what was obviously military gear, functional, armored, built for survival rather than comfort. The Zilani delegation had dressed in their finest ceremonial robes, flowing garments in soft colors that represented harmony and wisdom. Morrison wore combat fatigues with patches that showed unit insignias and battle honors they couldn't begin to understand. Where the Zilani moved with graceful, deliberate gestures meant to show peaceful intent, Morrison moved like a man who'd learned to watch every shadow and listen for sounds that didn't belong. When the formal introductions began, the differences became even more stark. The Zilani spoke in carefully modulated tones, using diplomatic language designed to avoid any possible offense. Morrison's voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd shouted orders over the sound of explosions and spoken final words to dying friends. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You sent a distress call," he said, getting straight to the point. "Said you needed someone who could fight. That's what we do." The Zilani council members exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't how civilized beings conducted business. Where were the ritual greetings? The careful establishment of common ground? The gradual building of trust and understanding? Morrison pulled up a tactical display that made half the council step backward in alarm. It showed the current positions of Ravager forces, potential battle zones, and something he called acceptable loss projections. He talked about flanking maneuvers, concentrated fire patterns, and strategic withdrawal options like he was discussing the weather. "Your enemy adapts fast," Morrison continued, studying the data. "They've learned to counter everything your people tried. That means we need to hit them with things they haven't seen before, tactics they won't expect. We'll need to coordinate multiple strike groups, probably sacrifice some ships to create openings for the main assault." Several council members actually fainted when he mentioned sacrificing ships. In their world, every life was precious beyond measure. The idea of deliberately accepting casualties to achieve a larger goal was utterly alien to them. You have to understand, Counselor Threxon said, his voice shaking. We don't know how to think about such things. Loss of life, deliberate violence. These concepts are foreign to us. Morrison studied the crystalline being with those hard, experienced eyes. That's why you called us, he said simply. You call for warriors. We're what you get when a species spends millions of years learning to survive on a world where everything, the weather, the animals, the plants, even the ground under your feet, is actively trying to kill you every single day. He gestured his mechanical arm, his scars, the practical gear that marked him as a soldier. We didn't choose to become fighters. Our world made us this way, and now that's the only thing standing between your people and extinction. The Zilani looked at the scarred, mechanical-armed human with his casual talk of acceptable losses and wondered if their desperate prayer for salvation had been answered by angels or demons. They were about to discover the answer was both. The moment had finally arrived that would rewrite everything the galaxy thought it knew about combat. For centuries, the Ravagers had used the same terrifyingly effective approach against every species they encountered. They'd show up with overwhelming numbers, technology that adapted faster than anyone could counter, and a ruthless efficiency that had never failed them. Every civilized species they'd met had the same predictable response. Try to negotiate, attempt to defend with minimal force, then fold completely when the situation became hopeless. The Ravagers had built their entire expansion strategy around this pattern. They expected their enemies to fight conservatively, to retreat when casualties mounted, to surrender when victory seemed impossible. It had worked flawlessly for thousands of years across dozens of different species and hundreds of worlds. They were about to meet humans. Commander Lisa Thompson sat in the captain's chair of the UES Defiance, a ship that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and pure stubbornness. The vessel had started life as a mining platform, been converted to a cargo hauler, then rebuilt again into something that barely qualified as a warship. Patches of different colored metal covered the hull where emergency repairs had been welded into place. The weapon systems were a mix of military surplus, improvised modifications, and equipment that definitely wasn't designed for combat, but had been made to work anyway. All ships. This is Thompson. Her voice carried across the communication channels to the rest of the human fleet. Remember what we're fighting for here. These things have been stomping on peaceful people who never learned to fight back. Today, they find out what happens when they pick on someone who grew up fighting. The Zilani observers watching from their command ships couldn't believe what they were seeing. The human fleet was outnumbered 3-1, outgunned by technology they barely understood, facing an enemy that had consumed 17 worlds without breaking stride. By every logical calculation, the humans should have been trying to negotiate or at least positioning themselves for a strategic withdrawal. Instead, they were accelerating directly toward the Ravager swarm. The first exchange of fire lit up space like a deadly fireworks display. Ravager energy weapons lanced out with precision that should have vaporized the incoming human ships. But these vessels didn't fight like anything the Ravagers had encountered before. Instead of maintaining formation and trading fire at long range like civilized species did, the human ships scattered into seemingly chaotic patterns that made them nearly impossible to target effectively. Beta Squadron, swing wide and hit their left flank. Thompson's voice remained calm even as her ship shook under enemy fire. Don't worry about taking damage. These things need to learn we don't back down just because they hit us. What happened next challenged every assumption about how space combat was supposed to work. When human ships took damage, instead of retreating for repairs, they kept fighting. When their primary weapons failed, they switched to backup systems. When their backup systems failed, they started ramming enemy vessels with their reinforced hulls. The UES Steadfast, a converted cargo hauler, actually managed to destroy a Ravager destroyer by using its industrial mining laser as a cutting beam, slowly carving the enemy ship apart while absorbing punishment that would have crippled any normal vessel. The Ravagers had sophisticated adaptive technology that could analyze enemy tactics and develop counters within minutes. But they'd never encountered enemies who changed their tactics faster than the adaptation systems could keep up. Human ships would start an engagement using standard military procedures, then suddenly switch to completely improvised strategies that made no sense according to established combat doctrine. Lieutenant Jake Peterson's Corvette lost its main engines early in the battle, leaving it drifting helplessly toward a cluster of Ravager fighters. Instead of accepting destruction, Peterson ordered his crew to overload their mining charges. Explosive devices normally used to break apart asteroids and detonate them as the enemy ships closed in. The resulting explosion took out 6 Ravager vessels and somehow left Peterson's ship intact enough to keep fighting. How are they still operational? One of the Zolani observers whispered, watching human ships continue to fight with damage that should have left them completely disabled. Their systems are failing, their hulls are breached, their weapons are offline. Why haven't they surrendered? The answer came from understanding something the Ravagers had never encountered before. These humans hadn't learned to fight in a controlled environment of civilized warfare, with rules and expectations and logical surrender conditions. They'd learned to fight on a world where giving up meant dying, where everything from the weather to the local wildlife was actively trying to kill them every single day. On Earth, storms could level entire cities without warning. Predators hunted in packs and never gave up once they caught a scent. Plants evolved toxins that could drop a full-grown human in minutes. Even the ground itself could suddenly split open in earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. Humans had spent millions of years learning that when things got bad, you didn't retreat, you adapted, improvised, and kept fighting until either you won or there was nothing left to fight with. Commander Thompson's ship took a direct hit that destroyed half her bridge, but she kept coordinating the battle from an auxiliary control station. Remember, people, she called over the communication system as debris and sparks flew around her. On Earth, we learned that everything wants to kill us. These Ravagers are just another Tuesday. For the first time in their existence, the Ravagers encountered prey that became more dangerous when cornered, more creative when desperate, and absolutely refused to quit no matter how hopeless things looked. They were learning what it meant to fight a species that had never known the luxury of surrender. Over the months that followed, the Zolani watched something that completely shattered everything they thought they understood about how intelligent species were supposed to develop. According to every scientific model they had, evolution naturally moved civilizations toward specialization and efficiency. Species got better at specific things, but they also became more dependent on those specialized systems working exactly as designed. Humans threw that entire concept out the window. Within weeks of the first battle, human engineering teams had managed to do something that should have been impossible. They'd taken pieces of destroyed Ravager ships, technology so advanced and alien that most species would need decades just to figure out how it worked, and not only reverse engineered it, but actually improved on the original design. Lieutenant Michael Harris stood in the makeshift workshop that had been set up in the cargo bay of his ship, surrounded by sparks and the smell of hot metal. He was literally welding plates of Ravager armor directly onto his vessel's hull, grinning like he was having the time of his life instead of performing what most species would consider an impossibly dangerous modification. You see this, he called out to a group of Zolani observers who'd been sent to document human tactics. This armor plating can adapt to different energy frequencies in real time. Took us about 2 weeks to figure out how it worked, another week to make it better. He gestured to modifications he'd made to the alien technology, crude-looking additions that somehow enhanced the sophisticated systems beyond their original capabilities. The Zolani engineers were horrified. They'd spent centuries perfecting their technology through careful research, extensive testing, and gradual improvements. The idea of just bolting alien equipment onto their ships and hoping it worked was completely against everything they'd been taught about proper engineering practices. But it was working. The humans weren't just copying Ravager technology. They were making it work better than the original designers had intended. You know what the best part about coming from hell is? Harris continued, not even pausing in his welding. Everything else seems easy by comparison. When you grow up on a world where the rain can melt your skin and the local wildlife considers you a light snack, figuring out alien tech becomes just another puzzle to solve. This was the death world advantage that no peaceful civilization could truly understand. Humans had evolved on a planet so hostile that adaptation wasn't just useful, it was the only way to survive. While other species developed highly specialized solutions for specific problems, humans had learned to make anything work with whatever materials they had available. The human engineering crews worked shifts that would have killed most other species. 30 hours straight was considered normal when there was work to be done. They'd grab a few hours of sleep in whatever corner they could find, then get right back to modifying weapons, patching hull breaches, or installing captured enemy systems into their own ships. But the really remarkable thing wasn't their technical skills or their incredible work ethic. It was what drove them to push themselves so hard. During the quiet hours between battles, when most of the crew was trying to get some rest, you could hear them singing. Not victory songs or military anthems, but old ballads from their homeworld, songs about protecting loved ones, about standing guard against the darkness, about fighting not for glory but because someone had to. Chief Engineer Rachel Brooks explained it to a confused Zilani diplomat during one of these quiet moments. "We've never known peace like this," she said, gesturing toward the crystal cities visible through the ship's viewport. "On Earth, beauty is rare and precious because everything's trying to destroy it. Storms, predators, natural disasters. There's always something threatening to tear down anything good you try to build." She pointed to the Zilani cities floating serenely above their garden worlds, their crystal spires catching the light like captured rainbows. "Look at that. 3,000 years of unbroken peace, art, and beauty. We've spent our entire existence as a species fighting just to survive, and you've had the chance to create something we could never even dream of." The Zilani diplomat was confused. "But surely you could build similar cities on your own worlds now that you have the technology?" Brooks shook her head. "Earth doesn't allow for that kind of beauty. By the time we learned to build things that wouldn't get torn down by the next hurricane or earthquake, we'd already become a species that was better at fighting than creating. But we know something precious when we see it, and we know it's worth protecting." This was what the Zilani had never expected when they called for warriors. They'd imagined that any species capable of fighting the Ravagers would be motivated by conquest, territory, or revenge. Instead, they'd found protectors, beings who threw themselves into impossible battles not to gain something for themselves, but to preserve something beautiful they'd never been able to have. The humans weren't fighting like conquerors. They were fighting like gardeners, protecting the only perfect garden they'd ever seen, willing to sacrifice everything to make sure it survived. And that motivation made them more dangerous to the Ravagers than any weapon or technology ever could. The last Ravager hive ship exploded in a brilliant flash of light that lit up half the Zilani solar system. For a moment, space was filled with debris and the dying energy signatures of the massive vessel. Then, suddenly, there was silence. After months of constant battle, constant alerts, constant fear, the absence of sound felt almost supernatural. Captain Morrison stood on what was left of his bridge, looking out at the aftermath of the final battle. His flagship barely qualified as space-worthy anymore. Half the hull had been patched with salvaged materials. The main engines were held together with emergency welds, and there were sections where you could actually see space through gaps in the armor plating. But it was still flying, still fighting, still protecting. Around him, the crystal cities of the Zilani floated like scattered jewels against the darkness of space. The way the local sun caught their surfaces and threw rainbows across the void was something no human had ever seen before. On Earth, beauty like this would have been destroyed by the next storm, earthquake, or volcanic eruption before anyone could properly appreciate it. Here, it had existed undisturbed for 3,000 years. The communication channels were filled with Zilani voices. Celebration, gratitude, disbelief that the nightmare was finally over. Families were reuniting. Cities were lighting up their ceremonial displays, and across 17 worlds, beings who had given up hope were beginning to rebuild their lives. Morrison should have felt victorious. His people had done something that most of the galaxy considered impossible. They'd stopped an enemy that had seemed unstoppable, saved a civilization that had been facing extinction, and proven that even the most advanced predators could be defeated if you fought hard enough and refused to give up. Instead, he felt tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from pushing yourself and your people beyond every reasonable limit for months on end. Around him, his crew was already working on damage reports and casualty lists. Too many good people had died to make this moment possible, and their names would be added to the long roll of humans who'd given their lives protecting others. The formal ceremony took place on the Zilani homeworld, in a crystal amphitheater that had been built to celebrate peace and harmony. The entire Zilani Council was present, along with representatives from dozens of other civilizations who had heard about what the humans had accomplished. They offered Morrison and his people everything they could think of. "Name your price," Counselor Zephi said, his crystalline features reflecting the light from thousands of ceremonial candles. "Entire systems could be yours to colonize. We could share our most advanced technologies, the accumulated scientific knowledge of 3 millennia. You could establish an empire here, rule over peaceful worlds, finally know the tranquility your species has never experienced." Morrison listened to the offer with that same tired expression he'd worn since the battle ended. His dress uniform was clean, but couldn't hide the scars on his hands, or the way he unconsciously favored his left side, where shrapnel had found its mark months earlier. When the formal speeches ended and the council waited for his response, he simply shook his head. "All we need is fuel, supplies, and maybe some spare parts if you can manage it," he said quietly. "There's another distress signal coming from the Andromeda Spiral. Some species called the Kythera are facing something they're calling the Devourers. Sound like they need help." The council members looked at each other in confusion. Counselor Zephi stepped forward, his voice filled with genuine bewilderment. "I don't understand. You could have peace here. After everything your people have sacrificed, everything you've endured, you could finally rest. Why would you leave?" Morrison walked to the edge of the amphitheater and looked up at the stars. Out there, somewhere in the darkness, another civilization was sending out desperate pleas for someone, anyone, who still remembered how to fight. Another species that had evolved beyond warfare was discovering that the universe still contained things that hadn't gotten the message about civilized behavior. "You know what we learned growing up on Earth," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent amphitheater. "We learned that peace isn't something you achieve once and then get to keep forever. It's something you have to protect every single day from all the things that want to destroy it." He turned back to face the council, and for the first time since the ceremony began, he smiled. It was a sad smile, the expression of a man who understood the weight of responsibility better than he wished he did. "Peace isn't something you have," he continued. "It's something you create for others. And somebody's got to do the creating." 3 days later, the human fleet departed Zalani space. Their ships were still scarred and patched, still bristling with weapons that looked crude but worked better than anything the Ravagers had been able to counter. As they jumped toward the next crisis, the next impossible battle, the Zalani watched them go with a mixture of gratitude and awe. They finally understood what they had witnessed. Not just superior warriors or advanced tacticians, but something entirely unique in the galaxy, a species that had been forged by their hostile world to be eternal guardians. Beings who would fight not for conquest or glory, but simply because someone had to stand between the darkness and the light. In the years that followed, word spread across the galaxy like ripples in a vast ocean. Peaceful civilizations facing extinction began to send out a new kind of distress call. They would broadcast on every frequency they could reach, hoping their desperate prayer would be heard by the right ears. "Send us the Deathworlders." And somewhere in the black between the stars, scarred ships with human crews would change course and answer that call, ready to remind the universe that some species had never forgotten how to fight for what mattered.